All right, so this is our lecture on bioethics, and I think this is the most important lecture of the entire course. We have spent a lot of time getting into the nitty-gritty details about all of these molecules and how they work and how we manipulate them and the techniques that we're using. But just because we can does not always mean that we should. We constantly need to evaluate whether the advances we're making in this field should be used, should be published. We need to think about what impact they are going to have. So, what does it mean to be ethical? Okay, if you're studying ethics, it means you're studying how motivation or behavior is affected by our morality. And morality is our beliefs of what is right and wrong. And a lot of people get being moral and being religious mixed up because most often our religious values are tied up in our morals as well. But they can be completely separate. So, then what is bioethics? That's a study of how our decisions and our behaviors and things like that within the biomedical sciences will be affected by morality. So, when we invent new technology, when we consider procedures and drugs and things like that to test out on humans, we need to come up with a special decision making model so that we can apply moral decisions to advances in biomedical sciences. So, like I said, just because we can does not mean necessarily that we should. We know that technology is moving at an amazingly fast pace, and we need to make sure that it is regulated. We need to consider our social norms, we need to consider public policy making, and we need to consider proper legislation. So, who decides these things? Well, this PowerPoint is a little bit old, but there are some specific committees and commissions on bioethics, as well as some that have been around for a while. When you think about the EPA, USDA, FDA, they're all very important in making decisions about what is right and wrong for our society in their specific departments. So here we see a picture and we see a doctor, and on one side we see Hippocrates, and on the other side we see an insurance agent. And so when you think about Hippocrates as a doctor, you should think about the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath is all about do no harm. Doctors are supposed to help people no matter what, no matter whether they have money, no matter what the color of their skin is, no matter what, okay? Whether we are fighting against them in a war or fighting for them in a war, things like that. But then on the other side, the doctor has this insurance agent, and the insurance agent is saying, listen, if you want to be able to practice medicine, you're going to have to do it according to our rules. And we're telling you, you can only, work in a clinic for free for so many hours, because then after that, you have to make sure all of your patients are charged. And just because this person needs a procedure, if they're over 65 years of age, we're not going to cover it because of their age, or they have a pre-existing condition. And I mean, I don't know how much you know about health insurance, but it's highly regulated. And these things call into our morals, our beliefs about right and wrong. And so when you become a medical doctor, you take this oath, but then you have to balance it with social norms, and health insurance is a very important aspect of that. So think about the different things that each of these men are telling to the doctor, and then how do you move forward in that? So some issues that we've seen, we're going to spend most of this slideshow talking about eugenics. And eugenics is an attempt to improve the human species through selective breeding, meaning controlled reproduction. Other issues that have been of bioethical concerns, looking at doctor-patient relationships, looking at the use of private information, and that's becoming very important, especially as DNA sequencing is becoming more normalized. What happens when someone has that sequence, who can get that information? And also things like consent. What kind of information is given to your spouse or your child or your parent, things like that. Stem cell research, a little image here talking about past issues in stem cell research. We know that between Bush and Obama, there were very, very strong 180 turns in their legislation. Um, when Bush was in office, he did everything he could to shut down advances in stem cell research, and Obama did everything he could to repeal all of those shutdowns and to allow for the research to continue. But there is a lot of issue with that and morality, because in working with stem cells, you have to create an embryo, which is a very small ball of cells. That ball of cells can fit on the tip of your pen. Okay. That is considered an embryo. They are undifferentiated cells. They do not have any organs. They do not have specific tissues. They're just a little clump of cells. But if that clump of cells were to be implanted in the uterus of a woman, it would be able to grow into a new living thing. But in stem cell research, when we're creating new stem cell lines, that little tiny ball of cells has never been in a female. It has always been grown in a petri dish. And by doing experiments on it, it means that that little ball of cells will never develop into a human being. So this is just a short list of a bunch of different bioethical concerns and things that we need to consider. So go ahead and take a pause here to look at all of that. But we're going to take a little trip down history, look at the historical use of eugenics, and we're going to look at it right here in the US. Because whether we want to believe it or not, we as US citizens practiced eugenics. These horrible procedures and laws that are being used in developing nations and in countries that still support genocide and things like that, that we're just like, oh, the US is so much more advanced and so much more humane. Well, we need to talk about that, okay? And so it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but those uncomfortable conversations have to happen. So what is eugenics? Eugenics is a way to make sure that the inheritance of human traits is as, quote, pure as possible. And the biggest question is, who was the one that deciding these things? What traits of humans are considered most desirable? Well, they created offices and societies for this, the Eugenics Record Office, the American Eugenics Society, and they forced families in all of their communities to make pedigrees. And a pedigree, if you remember from ninth grade, is just a pictorial chart showing relationships among individuals and tracking a trait. So what kind of traits were they tracking? Were they tracking, whether you had a widow's peak or not? No, they were tracking intellectual achievement and artistic ability. Take a second to think about that. From a 1926 newspaper here, we see heredity is a big problem. A home for feeble-minded people is filling. Those whose parents were not as carefully selected as dairymen will breed cattle. So we control selective breeding as farmers, when we choose which cows and bulls are mated together to produce the next generation of offspring. And in the 1920s, the argument was, why don't we do the same thing with humans to make sure we're putting together the best of both traits? So here we see a family sitting in front of a building. And if you notice, the sign there says they've won the governor's trophy and they are considered the fittest family. Can anyone speculate what makes them the most fit? I don't know what indicates their fitness level. And when we hear the word fitness, we immediately think about exercise. But here, when we talk about being fit or having a high fitness level, they're referring to evolution, meaning having the most desirable traits for survival and reproduction. some things that I've noticed. All of these individuals are white, right? They are all white Caucasian. Another thing I've noticed is that it looks like they are wealthy. I mean, look at the style of clothing they're wearing. They all have clean shoes on their feet. The women have handbags. Everyone's dressed with jewelry and their hair is done up. So it seems as though they are financially fit. Their race and the color of their skin is fit. It looks like for every female, we have a male. So to me, that indicates that we have all married individuals. It looks as though we see clear generational line differences. So there are a number of things here that the governor's trophy has decided makes this family the most fit. And so this gets a little scary, guys, right? Because the question is, who is choosing the traits that indicate high fitness in a human? Here's a page out of a textbook. This is tracking an individual. Her name was Carrie Buck. You see her in the middle. She's in generation 2, the female with the hand right next to it. And what they are tracking is illegitimacy and hereditary feeble-mindedness. So this woman, she was the offspring from an unknown male, and her mother's name was Addie. And it looks as though her mother had a number of gentlemen that she reproduced with, all of whom it doesn't seem as though we know who they are. So what we're saying is that these children were born out of wedlock, and therefore they are considered illegitimate according to the terminology. Then when we look at Carrie herself in generation 2, she mated and produced a single child. All of these dashed lines mean that the matings occurred outside of wedlock. And you'll notice the only solid line on here is between Carrie's mother, Addie, and the male number 5 in generation 1, Frank Buck. So that is the only marriage that has occurred here. So what we're looking at are 3 generations. The F indicates feeble-mindedness. And so what they're using feeble-minded to indicate are people that, for lack of a better word, and I don't like using this word, but people who are deemed stupid, who are a charge on society, who must be taken care of because they can't take care of themselves. And so this is a pedigree that is tracking the fact that she has been a member of this family of feeble-mindedness and illegitimately born children. So how far does this go, right? Now we're tracking it, but would we go so far as to make sterilization rulings? And the answer is yes. Please look, this is the map of the United States. This is the ruling in 1927, and this map is as of January 1st in 1935. Striped indicate laws that are in effect. The use of sterilization, meaning preventing the reproductive rights of a male or a female due to eugenic laws, indications that they are not fit enough to reproduce. And so it looks as though they're using illegitimacy and feeble-mindedness as the first things. But when you look at that family, well, what happens if you are not the right skin color? What happens if you do not have enough money? What traits are they going to use, and what traits were in this law that was passed? And as you can see, our state was a part of it as well, the majority of the United States. We've also seen this starting to be used again recently. It is 2020, and while we consider sterilization to be a horrible, horrible thing, it is as recent as within the past month. They have discovered, and I think it was in Alabama or Georgia, I'm not sure, but it was an immigration detention center that was ordering the removal of uteruses of hundreds of women, of hundreds of undocumented immigrants that immigrated into this country illegally and were kept at a detention center. And this is what the detention center did. And it took a whistleblower to go public with this information. And now there is a full-blown investigation. So 1920s, 2020s, we are still dealing with the same problem that society is trying to decide who is fit enough to survive and reproduce. So where did all this come from? These are some quotes. What are we trying to do? Well, eugenics was supported by the American society because, listen to it, it sounds great, right? We are looking to ensure the organic betterment of the race through wise application of the laws of heredity. If you're sitting in a town square listening to this, you're like, yeah, that sounds good. We want to improve the intellectual, economic, and social level of humankind. And everyone's saying, yeah, we do. And then looking at it from the negative side, when you think about the traits that were being targeted for these sterilization rulings, when you think about people who were charges upon their society, people who couldn't hold a job, people who couldn't pay their bills, people who were alcoholics and were unable to stay in their houses and things like that, people who were seen in public as undesirables. Let's say that, you had people who were saying, yes, we need to get these people off of our streets. We need to get them out of here. So how far does it go? Well, now we need to start finding these people, right? Okay, we need to start hunting for them and staying away from them. So they started posting all of these things all over towns, small town America. And yes, individuals from African descent were hands down targeted. They made drawings of these individuals and they made measurements of their faces to determine whether they would be criminal or whether they would be deemed insane, meaning mentally unstable. And so you could determine that this individual would be a criminal because of the color of their skin or the style of their hair, whether they had thick eyebrows, right? So this is getting insane, right? We're looking at identifying whether people have these traits of being a criminal, right? These behaviors, being insane, based on physical measurements of their face or based on the color of their skin or based on the texture of their hair and things like that, to the point that you could go walking down the street and if you had this little manual in your hand, you could point at someone and say, oh my goodness, we look at that person, and maybe they're chopping wood in a field somewhere, and that person would be arrested because someone looked at their forehead and deemed that it was a short, broad, high forehead, and as a result, we need to take them in. We need to put them in an insane asylum, or we need to put them in jail, or detain them in some way before, they do something to themselves. From a textbook, trying to determine, and I'm uncomfortable using these words, I'm using them only because of the lecture, trying to determine the level of imbecile or moron that occurs in mental development. So this is actually coming out of a medical textbook. So if you are deemed a moron, then that means as an adult, you are mentally equivalent to a 10 or 12-year-old. You can do work that requires reasoning or judgment, okay? So you can help out with things like that. But then moving down further and further, if your mental development is of that of a child, then you can maybe be a handmaiden. You can wash dishes or laundry, or you can cut wood. And it goes all the way down to the term they use here is idiot. And look at the job they think you can have. Your job is self-preservation. So in other words, if you have this state of mental development, then the only thing you are good at is trying to survive. That's the only thing you can do for your society, is just survive. So, some more examples. We have immigration restriction acts. So now we start using these measurements and these traits, the betterment of the human society, right, to determine whether people are allowed to come in our country. And so if you look at this immigration restriction, I'm going to go down and read number 3. So immigrating into the Commonwealth is prohibited by anyone who. Okay, so imagine you are waiting at you're waiting at an immigration office. You are hoping to start a new life in America, and this is what you're going to be greeted with: an officer who has the right to determine that you cannot immigrate into the country because you cannot write out a full dictation and sign your name in the presence of that officer in whatever language the officer so chooses. So let's say you are immigrating from Poland and the officer decides that they want you to write out a dictation in French. If you can't do it, they could deem you restricted from immigrating. If you like this phrasing, any person likely in the opinion of the officer to become a charge upon the public. So meaning I look at you and I'm like, I don't know, there's something about you. I think you're going to become a criminal. You're not going to be able to come in. Any person who has any sort of uh, conviction, if you were in jail before, even if you got out and you served your time, any prostitute, any person that is suffering from a disease, any person that the officer deems to be an idiot or an insane person. Okay, so all of this is starting to really gain momentum, right? Where we're hitting the end of the 1920s and the 1930s here, and in the U.S., this is where we are, right? If you are not exhibiting the traits that I deem physically fit, then I'm going to find ways to control you. I'm going to control where you move. I'm going to control where you buy a house. I'm going to control if you can get a loan from the bank. I'm going to control if you go into an insane asylum or not. All of these things. And again, the platforms sounded good, right? We want to keep our streets clean. We want our society to be economically stable and to be full of intellectual and artistic beings. It all sounds good. How good does it sound? Just let that sink in for a second. We saw the ultimate application of this. In the 1940s, we saw this political party rise to power using eugenics as their main, soapbox speech. We're here to improve the betterment of our country. And I mean, a lot of people supported him, right? A lot of people supported Nazi Germany because of what they were saying. And at first, it just started with taking these measurements, right? They're holding a caliper to determine the width of this gentleman's nose, to determine their immigration status, to determine where they were allowed to eat, to determine whether they were allowed to get a loan, right? To determine whether they would be sterilized or not. And then that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough that we controlled their reproductive rights. It wasn't enough that we controlled what they were allowed to do in our society. We just had to get rid of them, right? And the concentration camps were opened and filled. And the cemeteries were a waste of time on these people. Because they were deemed unfit. According to who? According to a small group of individuals who gained enough power, political power, enough money in order to go this far. So what about today? Are we getting these messages? Yes, I feel confident saying this. We are definitely getting these messages. We are continuing to see eugenics in our society. We are seeing political platforms that are full of messages that are divisive, and we are seeing individuals and we are seeing groups that are still trying to use eugenics in our modern society. So now that we have a background on how we have taken and used genetics, right, the inheritance of traits, to make decisions about what is right and wrong, let's bring it back to what we're studying in this class. Okay, what are some biotech specific issues? Looking at human gene transfer. Should we be moving genes from one organism to another? Should we be moving genes of humans into other organisms, other species? We are constantly putting our genes, like for example, insulin, into bacteria in order for the bacteria to make our insulin. Should we be doing that? Are certain genes transferable? Should other genes not be transferable? What's the risk if that gene should become incorporated and uncontrollable within that other organism? Also, what about genetic privacy? With DNA sequencing and the rise in this new field called personalized medicine, when you receive an antibiotic, right now you're getting what's called a broad spectrum antibiotic. But right around the corner on the rise, we are going to be seeing personalized medicine, which basically means that we're going to run your DNA, we're going to analyze it, and we're going to determine what antibiotics will work the best biochemically based on the proteins that your body produces. Who should have access to your DNA? For example, we know health insurance and pre-existing conditions are very controversial. What if we could determine the likeliness of developing a condition? For example, what if you get your DNA sequence and it determines that because of your family and the genes you possess, you have like an 80% chance of developing breast cancer? Should health insurance companies have that genetic information? Things like that. And there are a variety of other issues. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to just be flexing our how do I want to say this? We're going to start considering things from different points of view. Yes, I believe at this age it is very important for you to develop your own point of view, and that is not based on my point of view. So you will not hear me share my opinion. What I will share with you are facts. We will share the science, and we will talk about who would have an opinion about those science. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Who would have an opinion on that science? And we're going to explore everyone's opinion, okay? We're going to think about how rulings on certain issues would have an effect on many different stakeholders. And so we're going to practice being a part of this decision-making model by trying to think about who's affected by the decisions that are made and what viewpoints we need to take into account. So we're going to be doing some exercises on this in the classroom. And then ultimately at the end of this course, you're going to be working with a group to investigate a bioethical issue. And you're going to look at it from a variety of different standpoints. And your job is to enlighten people to what all of those opinions are and what all of the viewpoints are, right? We cannot fully understand these issues if we do not look at it from the viewpoint of every stakeholder. So that's the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, as always, please send me an email.